What's up, fam? Smash the like button for the algorithm, and let's get started with the story. A child was born on Ardell territory, a little provincial estate in the midst of nowhere. The man was really concerned, yet he wanted a son. The elderly woman wrapped the infant and announced that the man's hopes and wishes had come true. The child resembled the landlord. The woman inquired whether the parents had already chosen a name for their boy. The baby's mother stated that they would name him Paul Arley. She hoped Paul would be the light of the world. The boy was ordinary as a child. While reading a book, he overheard a man tell another to get as much seafood as possible. The servant consented. Paul felt interested and called out to Uncle Frederick. The man asked him what he wanted. The youngster begged the man not to go to the street near the South Mountain because he had witnessed an unusual flow of manna there. Frederick was perplexed and did not know what to reply. He asked the boy's father what these phrases could possibly signify. His interlocutor didn't know what to say either. Thunderstorm. Frederick rushed into the building in the downpour. Gray was already waiting for him at the entryway, expressing concern over his tardiness. The man dashed into the building, confessing that he had taken a longer route and pleading for pardon. Gray wondered what had happened to his interlocutor. Frederick claimed that he had avoided difficulties just now because he had followed the advice of young Master Paul. Gray was perplexed and questioned what that could mean. The father reminded him of what the youngster had said yesterday about not walking through the streets of South Mountain. Only now had he discovered that there had been an attack by beastmen. Gray was astonished and shocked to learn about it. Frederick went on to claim that everyone who had been there was in terrible danger, but he was safe because of Paul. The interlocutor got contemplative. The man looked at the youngster and asked Gray if he believed Paul could smell manna in the air. The man admitted that he found it difficult to answer this question. He considered what would happen if that were true. If this were true, Paul would be Ardell's future. From that day forward, the boy shone a stronger gift for magic. He could detect manna when he was 6, and he could express it at the age of 7. When he turned 10, the man sincerely stated that he wanted to hand it over the floor to the first-year representative. He asked the audience to meet the boy. Paul had beaten off several students from affluent households to enter the Ignant Magic Academy, the greatest magic school in the Radiant Kingdom. The serious boy was regarded as the best among those entering the academy. He was registered as the best applicant and thus earned the title of genius. This attitude bothered Paul slightly, but he consoled himself with the thought that his name would elevate the family's standing. However, he was not particularly effective in this. The man urged the boy to show the best skills among the applicants. Paul sought to maintain his confidence. On the first day of courses, it was evident that he wasn't the best, not even second. A teacher requested that he release his energy as soon as possible, but the youngster was unable to focus and release sufficiently. Paul didn't comprehend what was going on or what he was doing wrong. All of the pupils looked at him with anxiety. He experienced a slight releasing condition. Paul noticed he lacked the intrinsic ability to cast magic, even a meter away from his body. For a mage, his body was the very worst. The others quickly discovered his lowly roots and lack of magical talent. As a result, their attitude toward the boy shifted dramatically. Paul nearly collapsed to the floor after being shoved by one of his peers. One boy asked another if he was all right. Paul remained silent, but the other went on to imply that his friend had just touched a crippled person and may also become one. That guy's companion joked that he needed to wash himself immediately to prevent this destiny. He was quickly labeled as someone who was incapable of wielding magic. He was labeled defective because he couldn't even cast spells at the Magic Academy. The jealous folks degraded his current status. The guy who pushed him inquired why he was staring at him like that. He swung his arm, claiming that he had no right to gaze at him because he was unable to do magic. His stares became the greatest joy that his jealous peers could ever have. Paul was infuriated. He struck the wall with his bare fists. The man couldn't catch his breath and came to his senses, understanding that everything was happening in fact. He wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to become a magician. Paul Arley was the man who joined the academy with the best marks, looked more promised than anyone else, and worked harder than everyone else. When it came to his curse, he quickly forgot all of his benefits. They claimed that the genius got crippled in magic. That's how everything ended. Paul was in despair. More specifically, it could have ended so tragically. He just assumed it all stopped there. However, Paul could not have imagined that in the depths of despair there would be room for a miracle. The notice stated that the player artifact was activated, the status window was unlocked, the player artifact has been activated. The guy kept falling down, unsure where he was. He now felt as if he were deep underwater. Something told him the guy was the incarnation of the World Destroyer. Paul had no idea what this meant. He didn't believe what he heard and wasn't sure what to think. The guy became terrified when a big figure emerged in front of him. Paul was speechless when he noticed a bizarre person with open crimson eyes. The person assumed it was a dream, but it was far too vivid for that. Looking closer, he noticed the figure opening its mouth and knew it was attempting to give him an instruction. A picture appeared in his eyes. He had been transported a few hours prior to this to the Ignat Academy's training grounds. This time, Paul was called next. The man stated that all he needed to do was make a fireball and hit the scarecrow with it. As previously indicated, Mike looked at him and thought it was an easy exercise that any student would be able to complete with flying colors. For someone who couldn't use magic, this was an almost impossible feat. Paul was desperate. He had no idea whether he'd be able to utilize it this time. Mike yelled at the guy and insisted that he begin immediately. He understood he shouldn't stay, since he might fail. Paul began concentrating on his hand, attempting to separate mana. He trusted in himself and wanted to complete this assignment at whatever cost. In one movement, he increased the concentration of mana in his hand. The individuals gathered around were astounded to see the size of this ball because the guy appeared to have a lot of mana in his body. Mike remained mute, waiting for the man to reveal himself. Paul had some faith in himself and decided that if all else remained constant, he would be able to complete this assignment. He became enraged when he realized he had been caught up in it again. His hand stopped leaking mana again, and the person had no idea what was going on. A second later, he coughed due to tiredness. Paul spit on the ground. Mike asked the individual to eventually show himself, but he appeared unable to do so. The man insisted that he remove it from his body as soon as possible. The guy stated that the fireball would not leave his hand and that he had no idea what to do with it. Mike kept pressuring the kid because he was already in his senior year and should have known such fundamentals. The man stated that if he could not do normal magic, such as a fireball, he would simply flunk the final exam. Mike raged at Paul, saying he was bound to fail. The child could not help but agree with him in his mind. He clenched his fist and apologized, claiming he would work harder in practice. In this practical shooting test, they had to make 10 fireballs and strike the target several times. Paul was unable to load even one whole ball into the target. The child recognized that he couldn't even expect to be a third-rate mage. The boys made fun of him, not understanding how he got into the academy with the highest grades. They continued pushing him to give up since, in their perspective, he was the biggest moron. The child was aware that the top performer in the entrance exams was the offspring of a provincial nobility. His colleagues from more prestigious households grew to envy and feel inferior to him, which was the primary basis for their enmity toward him. Paul realized he couldn't take their mockery forever. Reality, of course, stripped him of optimism and began to erode his psyche from within. This curse, the mana release issue, was the only thing holding him back for 6 years. Although Paul had held on successfully all along, he began to wonder how much longer he could hang on at this pace. In the academy's hallway, the boys were discussing how their exam went. Someone in the crowd noticed the person and yelled at everyone, calling him a fool. The folks who often picked on him suggested that he pack his belongings early. The man stated that if he were in Paul's position, he would be humiliated to even reveal himself in public. But Paul was more persistent. He inquired as to if his interlocutor was aware of what the younger ones nicknamed him. The guy said that everyone called him a dumbass according to the boys because of Paul. The seniors did not serve as role models. The boys requested that he return to his province as quickly as possible while laughing. Paul stayed mute. One of the youngsters stated that nature typically rewards either with skills or fortune, but that he had been unlucky in both. Another child claimed that his entire family consisted of pompous idiots who had never had anything. Before he could continue speaking, Paul lunged forward and punched him, throwing his fist as hard as could. He slammed it hard into his opponent's face. The other guy was stunned when he witnessed his pal thrown back several meters with a single punch. Paul was enraged and asked that his opponent repeat what he had said about his father. The man appeared to have misinterpreted his opponent's objectives and just called him names while wiping away blood. He didn't think a man from a modest background could do such a thing. Paul emphasized that you should know when to stop and know when to stop, he said. These guys had no right to talk about his family. The guy's companion dashed towards Paul to strike him back. He was surprised by his opponent's speed at the end, just before the blow. With one punch, Paul knocked out his opponent, who went to his knees and gripped his stomach. His opponent was outraged and watched him suffer. The opponent was taken aback and couldn't believe how much strength could be hidden in such a dud. The man with golden hair began using magic to exact revenge on his assailant. He maintained Paul had no right to touch him. The person simply didn't believe his opponent would utilize magic at the academy. The opponent persisted and released the sphere directly at Paul. He looked unconcerned about the possibility of being expelled for this. The opponent asked that he die. Paul realized he couldn't move. The teacher was already running toward them, demanding that they halt immediately. It was too late. Paul had touched the opponent's magic. He buried his face and had no idea what would come next. His death had most certainly arrived just as he had anticipated. He embodied the destroyer of worlds. The status window was opened, the player artifact was activated, and the man saw a gigantic figure with red flashing eyes in front of him. He had no idea what was happening to him or where he was. Paul had no idea what was happening. The large figure opened its mouth and called to him. It stated his complete name, and the youngster peered into its eyes, terrified. He would have been certain that it was indeed his name. Suddenly, the darkness began to recede, and he opened his eyes, hearing his name shouted out beneath his eyelids. When he opened them, Chloe emerged. The teacher was relieved that the kid had finally awoken. For a brief moment, Paul knew that everything that had happened to him was correct. He got up a little and asked where he was. Chloe tried to put him back down, stating he was in the break room and needed to relax. She continued stressing that the youngster needed to lie down and recover. Paul claimed that nothing bad had happened to him. He was simply dizzy. He didn't know if he had lost consciousness. The youngster had no idea what type of figure it was. It appeared extremely genuine to him in that dream. Paul inquired as to how long he had been resting in that position. The girl explained that she had been watching him here all day. She claimed it was a tremendous fortune that the guy got off with such few penalties. Paul questioned if he was all right now. Chloe stated that they needed to do a few more tests and that he looked very decent for someone who had been directly hit by a lightning ball. The girl stated that he had no wounds or burns and that his organs were intact. She claimed that she had never seen anything like this before. The guy had no idea how this was possible. He was aware that a lightning ball was a deadly enchantment that burned the body in seconds, and he had received a direct blow from one. Paul couldn't understand how he was fully fine after such an onslaught. The professor went inside the restroom and apologized for bothering him. Chloe stated that she would go evaluate the guy's test while the professor was looking after him. The girl asked not to remain silent if something bothered him. Mike approached the bed and inquired as to how his interlocutor was feeling. Paul said that he felt perfectly well. The man said that was excellent, but a whole professorial council was being assembled for the occasion. He guaranteed that his offenders would be expelled without fail. Mike explained the cause. According to him, he was expelled for utilizing combat magic with the aim to murder as well as spreading false tales about the family's chief. He also acted rudely and bullied Paul. According to the man, all of the acts listed above were considered while reaching a decision. The guy lowered his head and admitted that he had also hit him. Mike stated that while he would be punished as well, given the circumstances, he would just be performing volunteer work for a month. Mike stated that he had one more question that he would like to know about. The man wanted to know if the individual had any artifacts. Paul was astonished to learn about. He stated that this was untrue, since if he had anything like that, he would not be intimidated by others around him. Mike began to ponder and concluded that given the artifact's rarity and worth, the boy's family leader would have already used it for his people. Paul questioned why his interlocutor was even inquiring about this. The man hesitated, but decided to respond. It was certain that a crimson light enveloped the boy's body before the lightning ball struck. It was as if a powerful item shielded Paul, reflecting the magic. The man didn't believe what he heard. He knew what an artifact was, but he couldn't believe it. Paul suddenly recognized that this could be connected to his bizarre dream. He responded that he had no idea what had happened to him and certainly did not have an artifact Mike hesitantly agreed with him. The man went to the exit, instructing the youngster to relax. I had no notion what had transpired, and the professor did not inquire more. He was interested in what his interlocutor was thinking. Now the guy reflected and understood that he had had an experience similar to a dream, as well as that strange voice calling to him. The voice stated that the artifact was open and accessible. It also mentioned a player. Paul remembered that the statue had mentioned something else, but he couldn't use his memories. He remembered a status window. Suddenly, the guy observed something directly in front of his face. Chloe was already approaching him with some papers in her hands. Paul understood it was real. The girl inquired as to his condition and whether he was feeling well. The man explained that it was not about his health, but about something he witnessed there in front of him. He informed Chloe about something blue. The girl had no idea what he was talking about because there was nothing there. She wasn't sure if the guy was sane. Paul couldn't believe she couldn't notice this window. The notification table had all of his information. The man knew that only him could see it. He decided to make up an excuse. First, Paul said that he must have squinted, but the girl replied it was not funny at all. According to her, the man's tests were normal and he could return to the dorm. Paul was pleased and thanked her. The guy recalled that today he had survived a lightning strike without incident. He had encountered a man with a red eye, entered an alternate universe, and received a status window that only he could see. The glass then revealed that he was the incarnation of Draw. The guy began to wonder if the Mage relic had been entrusted to him. Now another weird window emerged in front of his eyes. It was some kind of assignment. He had to develop his body to increase its strength. After reading the list, Paul knew that he needed to engage in physical activity. He didn't see how this could benefit a mage like him. Nonetheless, he had no doubts and decided to just attempt it. First, after hitting with one fist, he noticed that his strength improved. After hitting twice, the strength increased much more. Paul noticed the number was increasing, and at this rate, he would soon attain his goal. After another hit, the number remained constant, and he returned his gaze to the window. It appeared that the hit was not counted if there was even the tiniest error in execution. In this scenario, he opted to complete the training properly. It was night outside, and Paul was exhausted. He was relieved that he had finally finished. Sweat was running down his face. The window indicated that the work had been accomplished and that his strength had increased. Paul was taken aback when he heard about the reward. He detected something in himself. It was a peculiar feeling that was hardly perceptible. He felt it in his blood, and it wasn't just mana. He knew how he felt. The person had certainly grown stronger as a result of the training. He determined to put his strength to the test in real life. He smashed something in front of him with a single strike, and he noticed mana collecting around his hand. The person recognized that his strength and magic had increased significantly. The speed, air resistance, and strength felt entirely different. The fundamental has also grown, therefore there should be a second prize. The status window reappeared in front of his eyes. The next objective was to form a power circle. Paul read and knew he needed to replace the mana circles with power circles. He knew that after this, his mana will be replaced with physical strength. Everyone who studies mana has a circle around their heart. Mana is crucial in releasing and strengthening mana. The number of these circles increases with the mage's ability to control accumulated mana. The youngster possessed 4 mana circles, which is more than is typical for people his age. Nonetheless, due to his illness, they were equivalent to 0. Paul had a sudden realization. The mana rings in his heart were disappeared. The furiously circulating force took their place and power circles emerged. Paul was shocked by the new sensation. Power circles replaced mana circles. Paul knew nothing about magicians who did not have mana circles, and he had no idea what would happen if he replaced all of his circles. The child reasoned that he could then abandon his life as a mage entirely. Still, it was too early to succumb to decadent impulses, and he should put them to the test. The boy chose to use a fireball. He was shocked at how quickly he could generate it in his hand. It was almost impossible, in his opinion. Paul sensed an unfathomable strength in his hand. The size of the fireball made the guy comprehend the artifact's power. Paul was given a unique opportunity since magic operates on a basic principle. It takes an average of 10 seconds to unleash. Due to his inherent strength, the person appeared to be able to skip this stage and create a fireball. He was certain that this was the power of the relic. After another training session, Paul noticed a window appear next to him. He had no idea what work to expect now. He had read and understood that he needed to fill his body with magic in order to attack, but he had no idea how to do it. The man figured Dre had a similar illness, so he fought by infusing his hands and legs with magic. Paul had no idea how he arrived. Following this strategy, the man saw that a new work had appeared for him. He was astonished to learn about it. He needed to strike the target. Paul had not even considered the physical force method yet. Until the very end, he didn't believe he could become a magician with its guidance. The man understood he still needed to discover his strength. He threw a fireball in a matter of seconds. Paul was relieved that it worked. The duty was accomplished, and the guy became stronger. He sat on the ground and chose to rest. Paul was ecstatic that he had finally completed the work. The guy reflected on how previously every failure occurred at the discharge stage. Finally, he conquered it and was able to really experience magic. The guy still couldn't believe that someone had devised such a system. He had no idea who this draw was. Of course, Paul wanted to find out right away, but his body was becoming heavy. What surprising voices. Someone claimed that he appeared to have trained till sunrise and then fell asleep on the job. Paul had no idea what was going on, so the voices asked him to wake up. The guy became conscious after hearing these sounds repeatedly. Someone stated that he was undoubtedly not dead because he survived the lightning strike. Paul couldn't understand why his brain was so noisy. The guys swarmed around him, shocked by his abrupt appearance. They implored him not to terrify them again. Paul rose from the ground and stretched, claiming that they were acting strangely, as if they had never seen a sleeping person on the street. The boys went silent. Some men commented that this was unusual for a nobleman who had entered a respected college. He inquired if Paul had been drinking. The guy sent them all away, claiming that he was simply exhausted and fell asleep on the spot. The boys were still perplexed. They discussed between themselves, noting Paul's unusual behavior. "My friend," one of the boys muttered, staring at the spot where the scarecrow used to be. He was startled to find no trace of the scarecrow. He indicated that it could have been Paul. The guys didn't believe it and rejected it, claiming he didn't know how to use magic. The academy dormitory welcomed Paul as he entered the building. He was brushing his teeth and was shocked that the guy had only recently returned. Jason inquired whether anything had happened to the man, to which he replied that it was none of his business. Paul was aware that his interlocutor, although being the eldest son of a well-known family, was not antagonistic to him. Jason inquired in a cheeky tone whether the man had actually been with a girl at the time. He was a maniac, obsessed with drink and ladies, which is why he was continually sneaking out of the academy grounds. Jason did not stop, claiming that the man had not even had time to be struck by lightning because he was immediately grasping his head. Paul tossed clothes in his face, claiming that he went to the bathroom and had no idea what he was talking about. He felt better now as he relaxed in the warm water. Suddenly, the person remembered that he had another responsibility that needed to be completed. He wanted to prepare his body through exercise. Paul was startled that the prizes remained constant, although the number of repeats had doubled. The guy wasn't sure if his progress would continue at this rate, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. He was willing to do anything to become a mage. 1 month had gone since then. It turned out that the repeating activity could be completed once every day, but unlike the constant reward, the number of repetitions required increased with each day. If the construction could not be finished within a day, all progress was lost. That's why Paul never missed a day of training, and the person noticed some gain from it. He was relieved that the requirements for completing the task did not exceed 3,000 repetitions, else he could simply die. The man ran up and jumped. For the previous month, he had been completing these training sessions every day. The person even learned a new skill, which made him quite thrilled when he read about its qualities. The boys had recently discussed Paul's unusual behavior. They couldn't figure out why he was sleeping during class, despite the fact that he kept his gaze fixed on the board. The other guy was upset that his interlocutor had only observed this. He stated that Paul had moved to the training ground and was now practicing kicks. One of the guys requested them to ignore him because he'd always been peculiar. The guys felt the individual was attempting to compensate for his illness in this manner, which, in their opinion, did not work. Thus, for the past month, Paul fulfilled tasks while looking for hints concerning Draw's identity. Still, the man couldn't identify a mage with that name in historical records. He gathered books one by one but discovered nothing. Paul only had one question for himself. Who was Draw? The guy was quite interested about who had given him such power. Someone called him from the side. Jason dashed in and inquired whether his interlocutor had heard any news. Paul didn't understand what had happened. The individual assumed that because he was calmly reading books, he knew nothing. Paul was unsure whether something severe had occurred and inquired about it. Jason said the leader of the Ardell family had arrived at the academy. This caught the boy completely off guard. His interlocutor shocked him again with the news that his father had arrived here. Paul rushed to the exit. He hurried down the corridor, shouting for his father. The man on the side was chatting, and the father turned to face his son. He was quite pleased to meet him. They had planned some time to discuss. Paul inquired about his father's well-being, noting that he had been sent to this academy 6 years prior. The man replied that he was doing okay, as usual. The child inquired about his sister's well-being. Grace stated that she had matured into an adult and had begun to study sorcery. According to him, the sister sought to protect her weaker brother. Paul scratched the back of his head and admitted that he felt embarrassed after hearing about it. Gray claimed that the girl had always been self-confident. Paul turned to his father and remained silent for a moment. He mentioned that he was doing fine. Gray, perplexed by these statements, inquired once again. The youngster stated that he was perfectly okay and that no one was assaulting him physically or mentally. The father drank a cup of tea and considered it. Gray admitted that he had come here to find out whether the boy wanted to quit the academy. The man intended to communicate the sense that if he was having a difficult time, the house's doors were always open. He wanted to know what challenges his son had encountered during this period. The boy thought about it. Paul stated that he would be open and honest in this chat, telling him that he had been mistreated from the start. He rushed to impress his father by claiming that he appeared to have found a way out of the predicament. The boy urged they reach an arrangement straight away. He stated that a practical test was coming up and that he was expected to perform well. Paul stated that if he failed the test, he would do as his father wished. The child pledged that he would do well in the practical exam, and his father recognized his commitment and returned to the estate. The long-awaited exam day finally arrived. Everyone's attention was pulled to the start of the written exam on comprehending magic, which was announced. The lads were informed that any violations would result in the results being reset. They could begin working, and the boy grabbed the pen. The examination is broken into 2 parts, written and practical. The practical element is further divided into 4 sections: aim shooting, measuring magical strength, real battle, and one-on-one combat. Paul aced the written exam despite having a disorder of magical release. Throughout the training time and the practical portion, another guy from an authoritative household consistently took first place. Paul felt confident that this time would be different. He felt that this year he deserved first place. After finishing the written portion and several days of study, it was time for the practical exam. Jason called Paul out. He didn't understand why his interlocutor had been acting strangely recently. He was quite curious if Paul had any plans for the practical aspect. The person explained that he was only trying out a fresh technique to magic. Jason was pleased and inquired what he was going to do about it. Jake interrupted the guy's chat because he was curious in what Paul was doing there. The guy laughed as he announced his intention to take the exam. Jake claimed that it was unhelpful for his problem. Paul stated that he came just to take the exam, thus he saw nothing wrong with it. The guys began laughing at him. Jake placed his hand on the man's shoulder and explained that he wanted to offer guidance to someone who had failed the exam 6 times. He suggested that instead of going out and humiliating himself, he should give up. Paul stated that his advice would not be valuable to him. Jake went into a rage. He stated that he did not believe a person with such a problem could pass the exam regularly. The guy had absolutely no idea what he wanted from him. He remembered Jake had never behaved so brazenly and confidently before. It appeared that he was bothering the person because he had not seen this previously. Jake pledged to face him in a one-on-one fight. The first portion of the practical exam is aim shooting, which is officially known as the multi-summit shooting examination. His goal is straightforward. It is important to determine how many targets the future magician can attack simultaneously. However, this year's exam was more difficult because the targets were continually altering. Everyone watched and counted who hit how many targets. Angelo was unable to do anything due to earlier failures. The average outcome was simply bad. The other guys hit 3 or 4 targets at most. Nobody could have predicted that a minor issue would cause such a significant decline in results. Someone in the audience commented that the quality of the present grads left much to be desired. The teachers were plainly disappointed, but they attempted to calm them down. Oliver indicated it was Jack's turn and they could expect a nice outcome. Finally, he entered the arena. Jack yelled out to Paul, telling him to keep a close eye on his progress. Of course, the guy didn't know what his opponent was planning. There was a demand for the gentleman to begin taking the exam. Jack intended to highlight the distinction between himself and that unusual one. He began hitting the objectives. The guys were overjoyed, but they still had high hopes for him. There was no more doubt that he would be the first again. The man stepped forward, claiming that they had reared and nurtured a worthy successor to the family. Oliver inquired whether his colleagues believed this guy was the glory of their academy. According to him, he will undoubtedly be this year's representative at the huge festival. Bob requested the lecturer not to go any farther. He stated that this level would be sufficient to measure the level of existing grads. Mike couldn't understand why they didn't sit for a while and watch Paul perform. Bob was startled to learn about the guy since he thought it would be impossible to pass the exam with his talents. Nonetheless, they chose to pay honor to his perseverance by watching the full show. Paul stood in the arena, believing that this was an excellent opportunity to demonstrate his might. The person asked him to start the show. Paul accepted and began forming a flame in his hand. A second later, he attached his other hand to it, causing several fireballs to form around him. The teachers were astounded and didn't comprehend how the man could summon magic so swiftly. The boys were also perplexed. Only Jack was enraged. He turned to face the others, reminding them of his opponent's fury. He claimed he could manufacture as many balls as he wanted, but he couldn't release them. Before he could complete his remark, he noticed Paul in action. The person employed a skill to accelerate his motions. He recently acquired the ability to refract time, allowing him to move extraordinarily quickly in any direction for 30 seconds. In other terms, he resembled a typhoon. With a single movement, all of the targets were completely destroyed. The teachers were startled to see this. The pupils likewise couldn't figure out how this was feasible. Paul was relieved that he had succeeded, but he could not entirely accept it. All targets were destroyed. The man behind him wrote down the number 27 in fear. The crowd was startled to witness the guy generate his own hand magic and use it to hit the targets. Nobody comprehended how he hit 27 targets because it was the Academy's best result ever. The guys couldn't figure out how he could move that quickly or whether he truly hit all of the targets with magic. Bob rose up from his seat and began applauding. He commended Paul, stating, "This performance was incredible." The guys were ecstatic and began congratulating the guy. Jack was upset and couldn't comprehend how this could have happened. Paul was taken aback by the acknowledgement and ovation because he hadn't seen it in 6 years. The man felt a warm sensation go across his chest. He seemed to have a constant need to feel this way. Oliver couldn't figure out why the person struck the targets with magic on his hands. He believed that this technique had nothing to do with magic. Mike believes that the unique quality of magic is its endless potential. He stated that if all goes as planned, it will no longer be magic, but mathematics. Oliver tried to respond again, but Bob urged him to stay quiet. The elderly man claimed that today he witnessed a miracle performed by a pupil. He declared it flawless. Bob stated that he observed different points of view among the lecturers. Oliver was outraged that everything went wrong due to this guy. He could not have imagined that things would turn out this way. Jason dragged Paul inside the premises in a nice manner. The man asked him to stop. The guys approached him and began to question how he had pulled off such a trick on yesterday's exam. They quickly resolved to acquire favor with themselves. Paul knew he was an outsider until yesterday, but it all changed suddenly. He told Jason he was going to go forward. Of course, the guy irritated some people. He opened his room and noticed Jack standing in front of the window. Paul couldn't figure out what he was doing in someone else's room and yelled out to him. The guy did not respond, claiming that his opponent had become overly proud of gaining a few points through the use of something that could not be described as magic. He stated that Paul's contributions angered him, so he decided to advise him not to attempt to perform. The person said that his opponent was merely jealous because he had been in high places for 6 years. Jack became enraged and decided to continue the debate with threats. Paul carefully took his hand from himself. He continued to squeeze his opponent's hand. Jack was shocked when he realized how much power he had in his hands. Paul stated that it was critical for both of them to graduate, and that if he had a strong desire to smash him, he should do so fairly in a one-on-one combat. He let go of his opponent's hand. Jack insisted that no one had the right to compete with him. He couldn't comprehend that a man who had been at the bottom for 6 years would suddenly desire to leave. Paul stated they should just wait and find out who won. Jack requested not to fail before the one-on-one stage of the fight and shut the door behind him. He walked along the corridor. Jack pulled his hand out of his pocket, enraged and confident that his opponent would not even make it to their joint combat. He glanced at it, recalling the strength with which it was grasped. The guy was unsure if his opponent was a wizard at all. The second step of the practical exam is the assessment of magical strength, the Academy's treasure and a unique relic found only in a few locations across the continent. King Ram was converted into an item by the Archmage Freud 500 years ago. King Ram, encased in the artifact, absorbs wizards' mana and serves as a magical punching bag. In the second stage, pupils had to direct magic in order to achieve a high score. Paul understood that all he needed to do was aim at the statue and cast the spell he felt most confident in. He questioned Jason about it, and he agreed with him. The guy explained that this organization was known for evaluating harshly, and receiving a score greater than 20 from him was already considered commendable. Somebody decided to utilize a thunderstorm on a monument. Because of his weakness, the statue asked that he hide from sight. The organization quickly urged that the man abandon magic forever. The boys were upset with the outcome, claiming that everything was as normal. The statue asked the next one to stand in front of her. The girl dashed after the guy to take his spot, telling him to keep an eye out. The people used an ice ball to show the statue that she was strong. The orc remarked her strength was outstanding and that he would remember her. The judgment took the girl by surprise. The statue clarified her statements, saying she was impressed by the girl's hopelessness. The girl was angry and burst into tears since she only received 2 points. She claimed that this was her best attack. Several more pupils failed the test. The main man requested that they not express their feelings in front of everyone, but rather let others to express themselves. He announced that Jack was next. The person employed powerful powers to get the statue's attention. The orc did not sense the power and expressed disappointment in him. Jack expressed his pride in becoming Jerich Chill's third son. He mentioned his name in the hope that the statue would reconsider its judgment. The orc claimed that the guy's father was the same moron who requested him to inflate the scores, according to the statue. Jack possessed even less talent. The guy didn't get what he was saying because he had awarded him 27 points. The previous one advised him to calm down and call the next one Paul. Paul was nervous before the test. He determined to pull himself together and cope. Paul introduced himself to the monument and mentioned his name. The orc thought about it and stated that he had seen him for the first time. The statue decided it didn't matter and requested the guy to start. The boys were astonished to witness the flaming, explosive mana. They believed that using class 4 magic was still impossible for them. The statue was also perplexed as to why the man adopted such an unusual posture. Paul shook his head, indicating that he was launching an attack. He jumped high and swung. Paul felt incredibly confident. The guys watching were astounded as he moved the magic from his hand to his leg and instantly exploded it. The guys were equally astounded and concluded that such a spell should be assigned to class 5. They weren't sure what to think. Somebody agreed that Paul was a class 5 magician, no less. At this point, the participant was startled that his magic had worked. At the correct time, the guy realized that the statue's behavior was unusual. It was terrified that he would mistake him. The organization approached and inquired as to the identity of the individual. Paul stated that he had introduced himself earlier. The statue questioned whether the man was Dra. This caught him off guard. The orc stated that he had been waiting for Dra all along and had now received it. The boys didn't understand who the statue was referring to. They felt it was just confusing Paul with someone else. Over the last 2 months, the man had reviewed all of the available texts, but could not discover a single mention of Dra. Paul realized that the organization had some information about him. The guy asked the statue whether it knew who they were talking about. The organization responded that he did. Paul requested it to tell him more about himself. The statue thought about it and found the question intriguing. The interlocutors could not believe they had encountered his incarnation at the academy. The person was taken aback and inquired again what incarnation meant. The statue requested him to repeat his name. Paul introduced himself. The orc considered it and stated that they would certainly remember him. The guy who was recording the results urged the statue to tell him the guy's score soon, away before leaving. Two orcs stated that it was too much, so he would tell him later when no one was listening. He said the evaluation was over and he couldn't assess the guy's magic. The guy didn't comprehend what the guy was saying, but he needed to record. He stated that under the guidelines, Mr. Kingram was required to evaluate the kids anyway. The person insisted that the contract be extended for another 5,000 years, but the orc interrupted him. He became enraged since he had been judging kids who didn't even look. Like a magician, the guy apologized for years, but still wanted to know what score to give Paul. War considered it and decided to offer the evaluation nevertheless. He asked Paul which score he wanted, Z or 100 points. The guy was astounded to hear such a number. He kept his cool and stated that he wanted 100 points. The boys talked about his result. They couldn't believe it. Someone claimed that Paul had received such a grade for the first time in a century. The teacher stated that the student was once again at the center of the action. Paul wondered what the professor was doing here. The man stated that he had heard that he had earned 100 points from King Ram and that they had already reached the academy's head. He handed over a piece of paper and asked to keep it for himself. Paul unfolded the sheet to read about the artifact room. He questioned his interlocutor what the heck that was. The teacher asked him to follow him, and they closed the door behind them before going down. Paul was walking down some weird steps and stated that he had never seen them. The man said that this was the only area of the academy where everyone was forbidden to enter. The guy had no idea what they were talking about or why he was brought here if everyone else was forbidden to be there. Mike stated that they were standing at the entrance to the artifact room and that he was only authorized to go this far. Paul inquired whether this meant he should go in there alone. The man hustled him and said he'd wait outside. The guy opened the door, not comprehending what was going on. He believed that his reward was waiting for him there and wished to see it as soon as possible. When he entered the room, he was amazed. Paul observed numerous objects that he had only heard of previously. He thought that this was the Archmage's magical warehouse. A mysterious voice behind him commented that the man appeared lost. Paul was terrified and turned around. It was the orc who insisted that the man did not understand his actual worth. Paul was shocked to learn that his interlocutor was no longer a stone statue. The orc inquired whether the individual was astonished that he was not in the form of a statue. According to him, this was the only area where he could appear in his actual form. He claimed that because of the ancient mana that permeated this area, he could be there in his body rather than as an artifact. The man questioned his interlocutor what he meant when he mentioned actual value. The orc responded that Paul simply did not grasp his significance. He claimed that this was abnormal behavior for someone who had used the same item as the player. The guy was startled to realize that his interlocutor was also aware of it. The orc claimed that this artifact was extremely rare, the only one of its kind. He was curious about how the guy obtained it and what connected him to Dra. Paul admitted that he had no idea what they were talking about and had spent a long time trying to figure it out. His interlocutor remained quiet and thoughtful. He told of a creature who wished to become a god. One day he visited the Sky Peak tribe, to which the orc belonged. He was little and small, which was unattractive, but his power was so tremendous that no one in the tribe could resist it. Furthermore, he grew stronger by the day, and even multiple orcs were unable to defeat him. They respected him, and he lived among them as a member of their tribe. Dra taught the tribe's future leader the language and magic for nearly a century. Paul was taken aback by the age and wondered how somebody could live so long. The orc said that he was not human, but rather a black dragon named Drug. Paul couldn't believe what he'd heard. He learned that dragons do exist. The guy inquired as to whether or not this information was correct. The orc questioned whether he knew where magic comes from. Of course, Paul had only heard stories about dragons and thought they were just legends. The orc claimed that Draw was unable to wield magic. Instead, he was devising a method of combat, similar to the guy, by filling his arms and legs with magic. He inquired if his interlocutor understood what he was saying now. Paul assumed Draw was treated the same as he was. He stated that he understood him. The orc claimed that Draw had devised an ability that only he could use. He showed him how to turn magic into power. Dre used it to become the most powerful being in the world, but he was not pleased and continued to grow his strength indefinitely. This lasted until he destroyed everything around him, including himself. Paul ran through this information in his thoughts, realizing why he was dubbed the destroyer of worlds. He could not have imagined how powerful Draw was to annihilate an entire world. The person noticed that he had a new achievement. He had been given the title of Orc's Friend. Paul was taken aback by the unexpected prize. He assumed that conversation with such important heroes could not be idle. He also earned the talent Orc's Rage, which enhances strength for 30 minutes. Paul noticed it and considered it. He held a weird white orb in his hands, realizing that it represented his power. The orc noticed that the guy had gotten a reward for the structure. He claimed that Draw had a propensity of discussing such topics. While peering into, Paul handed the ball to Organ and asked him what it was. The interlocutor considered it and wanted to take a closer look. He commented that this thing appeared unusual. The man inquired if he knew anything about this object. Oregon considered it and concluded that it was not a thing, but an embodiment. Paul didn't know what an embodiment was. The interlocutor went on to add that he was always around Draw and couldn't ask him. He imagined Draw had locked him in the Spirit Stone when he died. This was the manifestation of his strength. Although it is termed a spirit, it is not the same as other spirits. Strand had a horrible personality and begged him for unlimited power every day. However, if his requests were granted, he would guarantee the owner unlimited power. The person inquired whether the incarnation was born from this stone. Orc answered it was, but there was no need to panic. He expected to wake up soon. Paul stared at Strand with terror and noticed that he was breaking down. When the person realized he was holding a little bear, he was taken aback. He didn't know what this could signify. The small creature was offended and said it wasn't a bear. Paul was astounded. He had no idea how a bear could converse. The odd thing threatened and begged that it not be called such anymore. Paul still didn't grasp who was in front of him. He questioned how a bear could possibly speak. The creature again attempted to emphasize that it was not a bear. According to him, the man had no right to compare him to an animal. Paul wondered who he was. Strand said that he was an incarnation free of form. He could be whatever he wished. The creature drew attention to itself, claiming that it would now demonstrate its might. Paul stared at it with amazement. Strand attempted to do something, but nothing worked. He was astounded at where his power had gone and why he couldn't reincarnate. He still didn't grasp what his interlocutor was doing. The bear suggested that the issue was that he was reconstructing on an empty stomach. He insisted that Paul feed him, which Paul found odd. The guy stated that there was no food in this location and he had no idea what he could eat. The beast was outraged and didn't understand why its present owner was so weak that he couldn't feed it. Paul was startled to learn that he was the owner. The bear turned away and went to bed, stating he would wake him up if anything unusual happened. The guy was still perplexed, but Orc was pleased to see this creature because, according to him, 1,000 years had passed, and his character remained unchanged. Added that looking at Paul and Strand reminded him of the good old days. They brought back memories of Strand and the Sky Peak tribe, whom he had met in his homeland. Orc returned to the throne and inquired as to what the man intended to do next. Paul didn't comprehend the question and asked it again. His interlocutor spoke to the strength that makes him stronger. He believes that technology has the power to either guide or destroy people. He sought power in order to protect his people from demons. raise the Ardell family name, and properly declare himself to those who detested him. Paul decided that was enough for now. He had a lot to protect, and he would not turn down this opportunity. So the guy chose to live his life freely for his community, family, and himself. Orc commended him for his intentions and stated he'd see what he did in the future. Despite learning about Draw's identity, Paul's daily routine remained unchanged, with the exception of one detail. He would call out to Strand and ask him to wake up. The bear appeared before him and asked whether there was any food for him. Strand's sole change in life was that he was given more food. He was preoccupied with food. He ate a lot of it, and not just any food. After finishing his meal, he declared he felt better. The meal in question represents the power he obtains through quests. Strand strengthens as the vessel expands, sharing all with it. He now got access to a unique on-year ability. This skill accelerates his development. Every time Paul gets stronger, he gains 100 more power. Strand was pleased because his master would receive twice when he received 2 stars. He revealed that prior to the ceiling, he had 31 stars. Paul was astounded since that was 310 horsepower. The child hadn't even reached 1,000 yet, but he already felt extremely powerful. He pondered how Draw had risen to such a position. He believed that completing missions was not the only way to gain power. Strand giggled and explained why he was termed outstanding. He suggested that if the youngster wants to know the secret, he'd give him a glass of water. Paul threatened to stop feeding him if he didn't shut up. Strand looked guilty and offered to tell him for free. There are numerous ways to become stronger. For example, you can attempt more challenging quests. Strength is also gained when crafting things or discovering an artifact. You can also boil ogre tendon to create an elixir. Strand stated that neither of these options suited Paul. The child was shocked since there were so many alternatives, according to the interlocutor. First, he must gain at least 1,000 strength, and Strand warned the youngster that his body would be unable to handle such rapid power growth. Paul felt he had become stronger, but it turns out he's only at the beginning of his adventure. In that scenario, his next aim is 1,000 strength, thus he must continue training. The person worked out every day to build his physical strength, and when he reached 930, the third level of the exam began. Real fighting. Strand inquired as to if today was the actual test. Paul said that it was, and he had been anticipating this day for a long time. In a genuine combat test, mages typically attack from behind, therefore there is a probability that the spell will strike one of them. This test will determine how much mages manage hazards. This step was the most significant. Jason unleashed a fireball. The guys in armor didn't comprehend what he was doing and advised him not to aim at them. Some guy said Jason was out of the competition. Knights were invited to assist with and administer the exam in order to ensure the pupil's safety and suitability. The guys laughed at Jason. The tests lasted 10 days, and the students were assigned different monsters based on their points total. At the end of the final day, 13 kids with high scores had been recognized. Since this is the last day of the test, everyone is curious what kind of monster will appear before them. The boys had no idea what type of noise it was, and their expectations were met as an orc appeared in front of them. Orcs live in groups and are distributed across the continent. They are far larger than humans and possess comparable intellectual capacities. They are inherently harsh, thus there are ongoing confrontations between them and humans. They didn't know how to combat him in this exam. They feared that someone might perish at his hands. Mike insisted that the mages remain sober. He said they should treat this like a real combat and give it their all. The orc went on the offensive, charging towards the knights. Jack formed magical spheres behind them to reflect his onslaught. He used a great arrow, but the opponent jumped back, and the spell missed him. Everyone was taken aback by how high he jumped. Mike commanded that Jake dodge. The guy didn't know how because his entire body was paralyzed with terror. Mike used the tree prison to guard the individual. The orc was tied up. He attempted to resist, but the teacher's spell was too powerful. Nonetheless, he didn't have time to touch Jake when he suggested that the guy drop out. The man banged his fist upon the table. Oliver was furious that Jake had failed the exam yet again, and he resolved to prevent Paul from passing it. The man asked Bob if he intended to continue testing in the same spirit. The old man inquired as to what his interlocutor was hinting at. Oliver mentioned that it would soon be Paul's time. Bob agreed with him, and the conversation continued. The man added that Paul was the only student to obtain a flawless score from Kingram. He believes that evaluating him on the same basis as the other students would be unjust. Bob stated that he understood his intentions. He stated that sadly, they had no other monsters prepared. Oliver stated that they had one. When the knights delivered the orcs, they were accompanied by another ogre. Using an ogre during the exam is obviously perilous, but the professors and knights are there. Oliver expressed a desire to see what Paul was truly capable of. A lengthy corridor appeared, and the man reclined against the wall, gazing away. The hero heard someone address him and mention the man's name. Putting his hand forward, the professor stated that before beginning, he needed to inform him that today's test would be more difficult than the others, to which the hero inquired. Looking at the hero, Mike stated that the academy had high expectations for him because he had given him the higher score. As a result, some people believe it is unfair to assign him the same monster as the others, making things more difficult for him. The protagonist replied that he meant it as well, but the man interrupted him and stated that he would not be battling an orc. The hero opened his eyes in amazement when he heard it, but it was an ogre, so he asked again. The bear grinned and mentioned that his first real opponent was an ogre. It would be enjoyable. The monster's hand was chained securely. The beast raised its head and roared loudly. Looking at it, Jason questioned whether it was the orc captain, to which the man answered that it was an ogre. The young guy frowned, believing that an ogre could not exist. The man grasped the blade fiercely, thinking he had been instructed to bring it. Looking at the creature, he stated that he did not believe it was appropriate to employ an ogre to assess skills. How strong was the student? Outwardly, ogres resemble orcs, although they are much stronger. They can break a skull or shift vertebrae with a single stroke. The person clenched his teeth and questioned if he was certain of this, claiming that even the knights were having problems arresting him, to which the professor replied that indeed this was the order of the academy's head. The knight grinned and commented that it seems that the academy enjoyed putting their lives on the line. The protagonist stepped forward and stated, yes, he would put his life on the line. The knight turned back and questioned, what? Looking at him, the protagonist stated that Paul, a test participant, was his main concern. The knight smiled and inquired what he was looking at. The knight assumed that this man was pitted against the monster as if he could defeat him. Frowning, he stated that if something happened, he and the professor would protect him. But wait, where was he going? Looking away, the knight stated that he was traveling in the wrong direction before asking what he was doing. Turning around, the protagonist said that he was preparing for the test, to which the man responded that he was not present and required to stand behind. The knight was shocked and asked again after learning that he would battle from there. The hero lowered his brow and explained that his spells were different from the norm. Looking at him, the knight stated that they would be unable to protect him if he was in front. This was no ordinary orc. The hero replied that he knew, to which the man questioned why he was taking such a risk. The protagonist removed his cloak and explained that he was simply determined. The man looked at the protagonist in bewilderment. Fred frowned, thinking that he felt no dread from him. He assumed that he was indeed different from the rest. The professor extended his hand and instructed Paul to get ready. The man clicked his fingers and announced that his exam was starting. The ogre's shackles suddenly slid off his hands. The beast charged forward, screaming. The protagonist also ran at him. The man asked him in terror what he was doing and assumed he was rushing right towards the ogre. The man shouted at him to halt and think about his plans. The monster swung his hand and yelled. Two flashes emerged in the sky. The hero, extending his hand forward, screamed about a fireball. Paul collided with the creature and flames appeared around them. Fred crouched down, assuming he had used the spell in close combat. The man shielded himself from the flames with his hand. The student squinted at the smoke. The man sprang up and questioned in amazement what smoke had appeared in front of the knights. The thought occurred to him that the Magic Academy student had launched an attack. He hoped he was still alive. Suddenly, the image of the hero showed through the smoke, and the knight believed he was alive. Looking at the protagonist, he said, how is he still standing? The professor smiled slightly. The knight placed his hand on the hero's shoulder and turned towards him. Looking at the hero, Fred yelled that he should have told him straight immediately. He nearly died. The protagonist apologized to the man. The knight was astonished and asked again, would he have allowed him to act like that? The protagonist then looked to the side and indicated that now was not the time to chat. Instead, he would finish the test. The ogre snarled and raised his palm as smoke poured out of his mouth. The man stated he should back off. He knew he was strong, but it was too hazardous. Fred grinned and suggested that he step aside while they figured things out. The man took a step forward, but the hero beat him to it. Looking at the knight, the protagonist said that this was his test, to which he inquired again. The protagonist frowned and said they should let him finish it. Paul looked at the monster and wondered how this had happened. An ogre 5 times his size loomed in front of him. The hero grimaced and stated that he must battle against it. Looking straight ahead, Paul perceived 2 causes for his courage. The title of Ogre's friend arose, which increased the possibility that ogres would not be hostile towards them. The impact of this title enabled him to talk with ogres. The hero believed that the first was his expertise, namely the title he obtained from the guy, which enabled him to interact with ogres. The monster's eyes flared crimson as he warned him not to approach and release him, and the protagonist assumed he understood what he was yelling. Ordinary people only saw a ferocious creature, not him. The ogre was terrified since he was surrounded by mages and knights, and a crucial mission arose: time to battle. He couldn't avoid the enemy. Let him defeat the enemy faster than the others. Aim 1 is to strike the enemy with a fist. Aim 2 is to defeat him. Strength plus 30 and improved player vision are the rewards. The hero mistook the second assignment for an unexpected one. The protagonist laughed enthusiastically and believed it was a magnificent prize for him to be forced to do the same duty every day, 3 days at a time. Paul pushed forward, a flame appeared in his hand, and he saw no need to hesitate. The protagonist punched the creature with his fist. The ogre glanced at the protagonist with horror. The creature was engulfed by fire. A notification arrived indicating that the enemy's fist's first goal had been fulfilled, and Paul stated that it was not the end. The ogre was furious and threatened to kill him. Suddenly, the creature leaped up and swung. The ogre was quickly approaching the hero. Looking down, the monster yelled, "I'm going to break his head." The protagonist carefully retreated from the impact. Paul gritted his teeth and decided he needed to uncover his weak spot. Rushing forward, the hero explained that time was a refraction. Knight was shocked and wondered where such speed came from. Paul ran forward and considered going closer. Flames appeared on the hero's hands and struck his stomach. The hero went on to say that he would also target the susceptible point. The knight frowned, thinking he hadn't flinched against the ogre. "Who was he?" The guy questioned, shocked what was going on, to which the other answered, "Wait and see." The protagonist attacked, and the pupil exclaimed that the monster was fighting back. The creature tightened his fists hard. The protagonist engaged it in battle. Paul suddenly struck from his knee. The ogre grasped his leg sharply. The protagonist soared backward and performed a somersault while in the air. Paul landed on the floor. Suddenly, the protagonist opened his eyes, surprised. The hero avoided the ogre's attack. The protagonist landed behind the beast. Turning around, the monster claimed that the rat was suspicious. Paul suddenly jumped up. The ogre seemed bewildered. The hero hit the beast from behind. The ogre suddenly dropped to the ground. Sharply, Paul jumped on top of him. Looking at him, he decided it was time to stop this. The ogre's fury skill makes him stronger for 30 seconds. Looking at the hero in terror, the monster wondered if he was really human. The ogre's eyes opened when he heard it. He hadn't expected him to respond. Looking at the hero, the ogre inquired if he understood what he was saying, to which Paul responded that if he did, what he was saying was correct. The ogre stated that he did when the hero yelled about exploding burning mana in attack. The anger skill enhanced the blow. The protagonist clenched his teeth furiously as he switched into berserker mode. Flames spread everywhere. The ogre lay unconscious. Looking at him, the protagonist assumed that this was all the bear. Looking straight ahead, he concluded that he was not bad, perhaps even better than he had anticipated. The protagonist stood in the midst of the flames. It was said that he thoroughly defeated him. He thought, yes. The students joyously raised their hands and exclaimed, "Keep it up, it's cool." The man frowned, thinking he had won. Bob smiled as he looked straight ahead. The knights gathered around the creature. A query was posed. Did he defeat the ogre on his own? How is that possible? The knight folded his arms and turned to the hero, asking, who had trained him to fight?